Hello, my name is Wesley. I am a grief counselor at Hospice of Michigan. I work in the Macomb County area, and I'm one of the facilitators of the Men Overcoming Loss group. This group is available to any adult man who is working through the loss after the death of a loved one. And so we invite you to join us. I'm very glad that you are viewing this video. This is a summary of our most recent group, which took place a week ago yesterday as of this recording a little late this time. Stuff happens and gets in the way, but it happened on April 20th on the third Tuesday of the month. And these groups are the first and third Tuesday of each month, starting at 6 o'clock p.m. So the first group of the month is focused on support, and it's a little bit more open and flexible depending on what the guys who join that evening bring into the group, what they're going through. And so there's a lot of dialogue, and the third group of the month, the third Tuesday group of the month, I should say, which is the second group of the month, is a little bit more education focused. And so there's typically a presentation that lasts for maybe about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. And then there's some discussion and application after that. So there's still some back and forth between the guys and supporting one another there as well, because that's a key part of why we do this. So anyway, I hope that you'll join us. This is from, again, the third Tuesday of the month group, so it's more education focused. So let me share my screen and I will explain a little bit about the content of this presentation. So I trust that you can see that. This presentation was put together by David Keller, who's another one of the facilitators, and he does the third Tuesday group with me most of the time. The four of us are a little bit flexible, sometimes joining one another's groups and so on. But anyway, so I hope that I do it justice recording it, and I will try to hit all of the highlights and also share a couple of things that I remember from the group as far as the discussion afterward goes. All right. So as you can see, it's about the Serenity Prayer, which possibly some of you viewing this video have never heard of. Most people have heard of it in some way, shape, or form. And some people may be very familiar with it, especially if you've been a part of any kind of 12-step program or perhaps done any other kind of study on it. It's a very famous prayer and quite powerful. And a lot of it applies to going through grief, which is why David put this together. And I think that he originally suggested this idea as well. So it was a good group. I got some good feedback from it from some of the guys who were there. Okay, so here is the main part of the prayer, the part that most people have heard. God grant me the security to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Let me just go on to the next part, and then we'll come back to this part and take it apart, dive into it a little bit, and see how it can apply to grief. Here's the other part, and I've only come across this because I was involved with a couple of 12-step groups and part of my training as a counselor, but I would never have heard of this otherwise. But it's still, again, quite powerful. And well, again, I'll say some more about it after I read it here. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. So again, we'll come back to this. Let's deal with the first part of the prayer first. So I guess I'll read it one more time. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I apologize, my microphone is catching my breath here a little bit. See if I can avoid that. So the first part of this prayer has inspired many written reflections, and they break down the prayer into each of the threefold portions of the prayer. Serenity, as you can see in this first line, courage in the third line, and then wisdom in the last line. So we will paraphrase and adapt each one of these reflections for our use, or one of these reflections, I should say. Here's the first part: God, and David added, or creator or higher power, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. And I appreciate that David did this with the other sort of references to that higher power, as it's referred to in 12-step programs. Everybody has different views on the nature of the universe, the origins of the universe, who's running the show, if anyone, what that all looks like, how we can relate to that being if we can, and so on. And so, whatever term works for you. Obviously, we could add an etc. to that. The point of going through this prayer this time is not to convince you to believe any particular kind of view of God or the universe or reality or yourself or anything like that necessarily. Maybe a little bit about yourself, because we think that this is effective for grief. But rather to give you this as a tool, as a sort of meditation, as a framework for working through your grief. And so we hope that you will adapt it in a way that works for you if necessary. So speaking about serenity, I'm looking at some notes here, so forgive me if my eyes drift a little bit. Serenity is the place where we are calm, peaceful, and free from stress. Serenity isn't a word in our common vernacular that is used very often. Serene, but that's a pretty good summary of what it really means: calm, peaceful, and free from stress. So I would like to share with you something that was part of this presentation, a little practice that you can do, a way that you can find serenity. You might say it's a kind of meditation. And so you can do this right now. You can pause the video after getting the instructions and do it right during the presentation. That would be great. You can also hold on to these instructions or come back to this video and do it later on if you would like to. But here's what the meditation, I would call it, involves. Serenity meditation. Begin by stilling your being for 1 minute. And perhaps you set a little alarm with a calming sound. When I do things like this, I have a chimes alarm on my phone. You could do 1 minute, or you could just sort of estimate, but still your being. And so that can involve focusing on your breathing, something that we often do on autopilot, but can be a very useful tool for stilling ourselves and centering ourselves. Just sort of notice what's happening with your breath. If you're breathing into your chest or your belly, it's better to breathe into your belly for, if possible, physically speaking. And after you've done that for a few seconds, you can sort of scan your body and find any places of tension. Perhaps I'll refer to myself here this morning, my feet, my neck, my shoulders. That's where I find tension in myself this morning, and so it might be somewhere else for you. It could really be anywhere, I found. And once you're stilled, focusing on your breath, the in-breath, the out-breath, and sort of releasing some of that tension as you breathe out each time. Empty your mind by concentrating on a single item, perhaps the flame of a candle, a distant star, if you're so lucky as to be able to do this comfortably outside, or a specific spot on a picture, any kind of image. And you may want to play some calm, tranquil music. And here's a little plug for our Spotify playlist for the North Star Care community that I helped put together. There's a reflective playlist that's a part of that profile that might be useful for this. Some of the songs are quite calming, and so, or you might make your own playlist or something like that, perhaps using some of that music. During this time, offer to your higher power any anxious thoughts from the day or anything that may be preoccupying your thinking right now. Um, and I guess without getting too into, again, this meditation piece at this time, it's okay to have those anxious thoughts. I know that we talked about emptying your mind, but it's really impossible to keep an empty mind all the time, even when you're trying to. And the important thing is to, when you have those thoughts enter, those intrusive thoughts or anxious thoughts, again, to offer them up, to let them go, to surrender them, and not dwell on them, not ruminate in them. Um, and then you can return to that peaceful, serene place of emptiness, you might call it, or I think just peace and not being disturbed by things that you don't want to be there. So this is a really powerful tool that we attach to this Serenity Prayer, this first part. Let me move on to the courage to change the things that I can. It's been written, when I am weak, then I am strong. Bring to mind any areas of your life in which, and you can apply this to the meditation, you can continue in this way, in which you are failing and want to see change. Just give a couple seconds of silence here. Bring those things to mind, those things that just aren't working. Ask your higher power for courage and strength. Let me make sure that this is tracking. Yeah, it is. Okay. For courage and strength to overcome these problems. Asking for help from that higher power to face these challenges. As you meditate on the image you identified, allow your higher power's light to flood your being with strength and hope, just as the rays emanating from the small flame, from the star, or from the picture are flooding the words with light. So imagination can be a powerful tool for these kinds of practices. Um, and this practice, again, is a powerful tool for uh, finding serenity, finding courage to face these kinds of challenges. And during the presentation, we had the guys name some of these issues where they feel weak, where it's not working for them. They feel they might be failing or want to see change. And we talked about the connection between feelings of weakness and grief. And some of the guys were pretty confused, and I was happy to hear that, I guess, saying, missing my loved one isn't weak. And some of the guys understood right away what we meant by this. Um, it's a common thing for people, and I would say especially for men, with some of the stereotypes, some of the expectations that we face. Um, Weakness can be tied to a powerlessness. And certainly when you're grieving, I imagine that you can identify with that feeling of being powerless. It feels like you're getting sort of tossed about by the waves and you can't control how your grief is going to look, how it's going to hit you, when, or how hard it's going to hit you. You feel like sort of like you're subject to those waves of grief. And that can be a feeling of weakness, powerlessness, a lack of control. And that can be disturbing to a lot of guys who find their identity, who find an important piece of themselves as being in control, as being strong, somebody who can handle it, so to speak, whatever it is. But that's just not the nature of grief. Grief is something that I heard Alan Wolfelt say one time, an author and speaker on this subject, that grief works on us. We don't work on our grief. And I think that's true. I've used the metaphor before of surfing, and I've never surfed as much as I would. I like the idea of that, but you can picture surfing, perhaps even body surfing or something like that. And when the waves come, you ride the waves, you go with them. And it's a lot less of an aggressive or painful experience when you can ride that wave and go where it's taking you and not resist it, but sort of surrender to it. And you also have more control if you think about that when you're riding the wave instead of trying to resist it. You're sort of working in conjunction with that wave. Um, you have some control if you're a skilled surfer, I would imagine, over where you're going and what happens to you and whether or not you wipe out. Uh, but you also need to understand that the wave is going to have some control over what direction you're going. And of course, don't take this idea too far. It's possible to surrender to your grief to the point where it takes over your life and paralyzes you. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when that wave of emotion, of whatever the feeling might be, comes up, instead of resisting it and trying to push it down, um, sort of you let it out and express it. Perhaps you need to find a place that is a little more comfortable for you than your day-to-day places. Um, and so perhaps you hold it in for an hour or two if necessary, if possible. But let that out and see where it takes you and express those feelings. Something I often find myself reminding people is that it's not going to destroy you. It might be quite terrifying, that feeling of loss of control and those painful feelings, but you will survive it. You'll make it through that sort of wave, and um, then you feel better afterward after expressing that, after getting it out. So whether that's through crying or talking, yelling, even writing, certainly, creating something, whatever it might be. Um, I guess that's a practical, some practical examples of how you can ride that wave. And coming back to the presentation, um, working through your grief, changing the things that you can. This is a way that you can face your grief, which takes courage. Um, as David put in this presentation in the notes here about when I am weak, I am strong. That's very much true of going through the grief process. It can feel like weakness, like falling apart, like losing. But really, the weaker thing to do is to try and hide from your grief all the time, which involves feeling like you're holding it together. But really, you are being a victim of your grief, you might say. I'm trying to think of the right term precisely, but basically, you are at the mercy of your grief, and it's affecting you in all kinds of ways. If that's the way that you're trying to go through it, it's understandable if that's the way you're trying to go through it. Again, nobody wants to feel these kinds of things, but the only way really to do it is to find the courage to face it, and at times to fall apart, or to be honest with yourself about how you're feeling and to get that out, to express it, um, talking about it, and so on. Let me move on. Oops. Okay, the wisdom to know the difference. And again, let me just make sure the slideshow is tracking. It is. Wisdom to accept the change. Wisdom to accept the unchangeable. Wisdom to understand that you are not all powerful. Wisdom to understand that we are stronger when we are together in community. Wisdom to believe that our higher power has taken over your caretaking role for your loved one. Wisdom to see that love and grace for yourself leads to love and grace for others and for the world. Perhaps play that part back, because there's a lot of content there, a lot of different kinds of wisdom. And I talked a little bit in our group about the difference between what I would term as wisdom versus knowledge. I see knowledge as information-based, the kinds of things that you learn in school, in academic settings, by reading. And information and knowledge can be incredibly useful. They definitely have their place in our lives, in our society, in our grief journey even. Knowledge involves the kinds of tools that you can know about, so that, when different things happen, different challenges come up, you can sort of connect the dots and be like, you know, uh, A, this thing is happening. B, now I know this is what I need to do. I know it. I've got that information. And so it definitely has its place. But then wisdom is really about experiencing, about acting, about knowing what to do. I think that David used the example of uh, when your car breaks down on the side of the road. Knowledge is about knowing that your car isn't working, and wisdom is about knowing how to fix the problem. Or maybe knowledge is about knowing what the problem is, and wisdom is knowing how to fix it. So that's one example that works pretty well, I think. Wisdom is about, uh, there are certain ancient truths, deep truths that we can hold on to, and wisdom is something that we make a part of ourselves, so that when things come up, it's almost intuitive. It's not like, let me search through the catalog of my information, of my knowledge to know, you know, when A happens, then do B. But rather, it is a way of being. It's a way of knowing that is, again, intuitive. Like um, when you face the actual, practical, real life challenges, such as grief, how to handle it, how to think about it, how to respond in different situations. So uh, it's a hard thing to put into words. If you can't tell, I'm struggling a little bit. But some of these examples, accepting change, accepting the unchangeable, knowing, I would say, that we have a very limited control in our lives, and learning to be okay with that. That's an example of wisdom, learning to how to live with that truth, understanding that you're not all powerful. So there we go. Understanding that we're stronger when we're together in community. That's sort of an ancient truth, something that we're losing track of, or perhaps relearning in some cases. Believing that our higher power has taken over the caretaking role for your loved one. That's a hard one. That wherever your loved one is, assuming that you have some kind of a higher power, an idea of uh, where your control ends and where the control lies after that. And that's a tough one. We talked a little bit about that and how difficult it can be. And I distinguish between two things. One, um, trusting that somebody else out there, and I'll use the term God in this situation. Uh, but again, if that doesn't work for you, I think that it applies anyway. Um, Perhaps you believe, or perhaps you struggle to believe, that your loved one is in God's presence, that your loved one is safe, that your loved one is being cared for. So that's one part of it. Perhaps you don't struggle with that. There's another part of it, and that is, uh, I have been my loved one's caregiver. Whether they died rather suddenly, and we just had a relationship where we took care of one another, or perhaps I saw myself as the main caregiver in that relationship. Or if it, like in many cases, their death and their end of life was a little bit more drawn out, and perhaps you were their caregiver for years, they really relied on you. That was a part of that was a role for you. That was a part of who you were. And so when your loved one died, that role was also taken from you, and you are left figuring out, not only how do I live without this person and all that they have been to me, and just having their presence in my life, their physical presence and their concentrated presence in this person, but also, now what do I do? Now who am I that I don't have this caregiving role? What am I going to do with this time and energy? That's a difficult thing to face and to work through. So even if you trust that your loved one is at peace and with God, or whatever language you would use, and that in itself can be a challenge, it's okay to still struggle with this idea that now God, the higher power, has taken over the caregiving role, because that means that you've got to figure out how to redefine yourself. That's a huge task, and it takes time. So um, anyway, examples of wisdom. And then finally, here's the rest of the prayer again. And we won't spend as much time here, but I'll read it again. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time. I would point out that being in the present um, is a central part of pretty much every religious tradition, at least some branches of it. And I find it to be um, a huge piece of wisdom to try and be in the present moment, in this moment. Again, going back to spirituality and the Christian and Jewish tradition of God being I am, not I was and I will be. Although that's part of the picture too, from those religious perspectives. But ultimately I am. And, we can meet our higher power there in the present moment. Accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. That's another piece of wisdom right there. Taking, as he did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it. It's important as well to be able to see not only the potential, that is important, that's a part of it too. There's sort of a paradox there. We want to be able to see beyond what is, but also we need to be able to see what actually is and accept that just as it is in order to be able to find that potential. Trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will. That surrender is huge. A lot of wisdom here in this prayer. That the higher power will eventually bring all things to right. And the key word is eventually, and somehow, in ways that are beyond us. That's why it's the higher power. And it takes an element of surrender, understanding that we don't have control. That's what this prayer is really all about. That I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. Thinking about happiness not as the be-all, end-all, understanding that happiness is in some cases overrated. It doesn't have to control our lives. It's nice to enjoy those moments of happiness when we can get them. But that's not the whole story. And in fact, that wouldn't even make for a very good story to have happiness all the time. But thinking about the eternal, those things that last, those things that will be around even after we are gone, or perhaps that will go with us after we're gone, those things that are at the nature of the way that things are, that are a part of that higher power, that's what we focus on. That's the invitation. And so I apologize if this came across as rather preachy, but I do think that there's a connection between, a connection between some of these pieces of wisdom, and in some cases it's part of religious traditions, and going through grief, because there is a surrendering, a trusting, an acknowledging of reality, understanding the limitations of our control. These are some of the keys to finding serenity, courage, and wisdom, the way that I see it. And that's what we talked about in the group. Let me share something else that came up in the group. I'm trying to remember, because there was about wisdom, there was about letting go of that. Oh, here's what it was. A couple of guys, but then they were talking about their weakness, their feeling of weakness. Talked about how just feeling like they're not sure if they can go on. And they specified they weren't, thinking about killing themselves specifically, but just like they don't want to live their lives. They don't have that desire or that drive to live their lives if it's always going to be like this. And so we talked about how appreciating and thanking them for their honesty, because I think that everybody in the virtual room could relate to that feeling. And understanding that that's normal and that's okay to feel that way. Not that it's something that we look for and we hope for and we want, but it's a part of losing somebody very important to you. It's a part of grief. It is a very painful. We don't sugarcoat it. And that sometimes the only thing that gets you through is the hope that it's not always going to be this way. And I will tell you as a grief counselor that if you're working through your grief, and especially if you have support as well, it's not always going to be this hard. You can perhaps even think back, if you're months down the journey, think back to early on. And if you've done some grief work during that time, I would be quite confident saying that you have made some progress, and that's going to continue. And you're always going to miss your loved one. You're always going to love them and remember them and care for them. And so the grief will always be there in some ways. Going back to the wave metaphor once again, the waves will always be there, but eventually it gets less intense, less painful, less scary. It becomes like standing on the edge of the beach and you have the tide, and it's just sort of a reminder. And once in a while, a bigger wave comes along and you feel the force of it, but it becomes a lot more manageable. It doesn't preoccupy you all the time, and that's healing, and that's the way that it's supposed to work. It doesn't mean you don't love your loved one anymore. It just means that you're healing and you are working toward the kind of life that they would want you to live. I can only imagine if they really love you. Uh, we don't want our loved ones to live in misery after we're gone. And, somebody that important to you, um, I hesitate to put words in their mouth, but um, they don't want that for you either. I think that's pretty universal. So, uh, but we talked about just again emphasizing that that is normal. And if you're there right now, know that you're not alone. Know that that's part of the process, part of the journey. It's to be expected, and it can get better. So, nice segue into joining live, because getting support is key to getting better, to healing. Some of the benefits of joining with us, if you're able to, are getting specific feedback about what's going on in your life, because there are a million different variables, and so your journey is not going to look like everybody else's, and so this presentation isn't going to speak to everybody the same way, and it may not speak to some people at all, and that's to be expected. We're not disillusioned about that, or delusioned about that. Participating in others' grief journeys is really an honor, and it's something you yourself learn from. Healing, there's the healing group dynamic, just that there's nothing like that experience of being around other people who say, I've been there too, or I'm there with you. It's a very helpful thing to know that you're not alone. And I can tell you that you're not alone, but you can't really know it quite as profoundly as when you actually experience it for yourself. And then when you're in person, oh, this is going back to the old days of yore when we gathered together in person. But this applies now as well. We've adjusted the group. When you join us virtually, as we're doing right now, there's personal processing with a trained facilitator, such as myself, like David, and then Will and Matt. These guys are all experienced and they know what they're talking about. And so there's no such thing as an expert in your own grief, but we've talked to a lot of people and learned from them, and so we may have some knowledge or even some wisdom to offer that can be helpful. But we don't have any shortcuts, and we don't have all the answers. That's for sure. But here's how you can join, because even though we don't have all the answers, some of these benefits are pretty great. I think you would probably agree whether you've joined us before or not. Here's how you can join, and I'll just let you go ahead and look at this slide. You can join via our website. You can also 877-853-5247. Oh, that's to dial in over the phone if you are unable to or don't want to join. And again, there's a reference here. We need to take this out of the slide. That's my bad, about the in-person meetings. Those are not happening right now, but speaking of hope for the future, we hope to get back there someday. Personally, I'm hoping sometime this year in 2021, but I don't put too much stock in those kinds of expectations. So we take it as it comes. Anyway, thank you for viewing this. Sorry, perhaps, I don't know if there's a need to apologize or not, but it was a little longer than I expected. I hope that some of the stuff was helpful for you. Again, I got some good feedback from some of the guys in the group. And so I hope that it is helpful to you wherever you're at. Thank you for looking at it. Please feel free to share it with anyone who you think might also benefit from it. And this is also sort of a taste of the kind of stuff that we talk about in our group. And of course, you've got a lot more people in the virtual room. And so it's not just me going on and on. And so I hope that this was somewhat helpful. And if you're able to join us for the group live, then that will be all the more helpful. I'm pretty confident saying that. So take good care of yourself. Our next group at this time is going to be the first Tuesday of the month, as always, and that'll be May 4th, coming up in a week at this time. So May 4th at 6 p.m., get in touch with us with some of those ways that you saw on the last slide and register if that's something that you're interested in. Thank you.